Okay, so we want to think about Pesach, Passover Seder. We want to think about the idea, in addition to understanding the history. A lot of what we try to do is think about what is the relevance to us, because the notion in Judaism in general, but in Hasidism in particular, is that we don't really celebrate anniversaries. I know it sounds funny. We don't really believe in anniversaries in the conventional sense. Of course, we like anniversaries and we buy anniversary cake. It's all good. But what is an anniversary in the conventional sense? It's commemorating something that happened in the past. But from Judaism's perspective, we're not really commemorating something that happened in the past as much as connecting to the energy that was available in the past, but now is becoming available again. In other words, all the historic holidays, for example, Passover, the holiday of freedom, it's not that we're commemorating the freedom that we had 3,300 years ago, or we received 3,300 years ago. It's that too, but we understand that that energy, that spiritual energy of freedom that was available to the Jewish people then is available now as well. And it's our job to tap into it. And the same thing, by the way, is with every Jewish holiday. Every holiday has a theme, but the theme is not necessarily, is not about commemorating the past. It's about reconnecting to it in the present and reconnecting to that energy that was available then and now is available again. So that's just by way of introduction. Now, when we think about the Exodus from Egypt, it is a very important principle in the Torah. The Torah keeps going back to the concept that you have to remember that you were slaves in Egypt. Many of the commandments incorporate that idea of the Exodus as a reason for the commandment. Many of the mitzvot of treating other people with dignity, Torah says, "V'zacharta," remember that you were a slave in Egypt. So if you were oppressed, you also remember the feeling and you will be aware not to oppress others. And so much of the Jewish calendar is based around remembering and commemorating or reconnecting to the energy of the Exodus. So we start with the holidays. There are three biblical holidays. Passover is obviously commemoration of the Exodus, but even Sukkot, the other major 7-day holiday, in Israel it was 7 days, out of Israel it's 8, is also a commemoration of the Exodus. Why? Why do we sit in the Sukkah for 7 days or 8 days out of Israel? Because God placed us in huts when we left Egypt. So essentially, Sukkot is also about the Exodus. And then Shavuot, okay, Shavuot, we got the Torah, it's a continuation to the Exodus. So we have three major holidays mentioning the Exodus, and we mention it in the liturgy, mention it in the Kiddush when we sanctify the day over a cup of wine. We're mentioning Zecher L'Yitziat Mitzrayim, a commemoration for the Exodus. And then you have, okay, 3 times a year still would be reasonable, but then you have every Shabbat. In the liturgy, in the prayers, and as well as the Kiddush, we say again, Zecher L'Yitziat Mitzrayim, a commemoration for the Exodus from Egypt. What does Shabbat have to do with the Exodus? Simply, in the 10 Commandments, the Torah, at least the first time they appear, the Torah says that the reason why we rest on Shabbat is because God created the world in 6 days, and on the 7th day he rested. Therefore, God commands us to rest on Shabbat. So in other words, conventionally speaking, the Shabbat is Shabbat is a commemoration of not of the Exodus, but of creation. However, there's another reason for Shabbat, and that reason is again that's to remember the Exodus. So in Deuteronomy, the Torah says rest on Shabbat. Why? Because you remember that you were slaves in Egypt for slaves in Egypt, and God took you out. Therefore, you rest on Shabbat. What does that have to do with anything? Well, the one thing a slave does not control is their time. They can't decide to rest. So if we have the opportunity to rest on Shabbat every 7 days, so that's a testament to our freedom. So Shabbat is also a commemoration of the Exodus. So what are we up to? We have 3 major holidays plus we have every Shabbat. That's again 53 days a year. Now it's becoming a little bit excessive. How much do we have to focus on the commemoration of the Exodus of Egypt? And as we know, we talk about this every year. There's also a commandment to commemorate the Exodus from Egypt every single day. Every day you have to commemorate the Exodus from Egypt. Now, it's not just every day, but as you read in the Haggadah, when we start reading the story, there's this debate that breaks out on the very first page or the second page between the rabbis, the majority of the rabbis, and Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah and Ben Zoma. And the question is, do you have to also commemorate the Exodus from Egypt every night? Is it sufficient to just mention the Exodus during the day, every day, or do you have to mention it at night as well? Okay, the halacha, the law follows that we mention it twice a day, the morning and at night. And that's why in the Shema, in the third paragraph of the Shema, we conclude, I'm the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt. So we're commemorating the Exodus from Egypt. So the question here is, isn't this a little bit excessive? Yes, I understand it's very important to commemorate the Exodus, but we're talking about 3 holidays, every single Shabbat, every day, twice a day. It seems too much. It seems too much to commemorate something of the past. And here we get to the Kabbalistic Hasidic idea. And the idea is, yes, if we're just commemorating the past, it is excessive. It would be a little obsessive to keep talking about the Exodus all these thousands of years later. Once a year, I understand, but every day you're mentioning the Exodus. And here we get to the first meditation. And the first meditation is that, what is the meaning of Egypt? And the etymology, source of the word Egypt, Mitzrayim, in Hebrew is Mitzrayim, which is Egypt in English, but in Hebrew it's Mitzrayim. And Mitzrayim means limitation. Mitzrayim means narrow straits. That's what Mitzrayim means. So the idea is that the reason why the Torah keeps telling us to commemorate the Exodus from Egypt is because the Torah wants to remind us that God gives us the power to break out of Egypt, not just the Egypt of the past, but also the ongoing Egypt of the present. Every day is an Egypt, because every day I'm in a limitation. Which limitation? Well, I'm limited by how much I can advance, how much I grew, how much I understand, how much I feel, my kindness, etc. Every area of life, even if I'm doing very well, it's still a limitation. And compared to yesterday I was free if I was in this state. But if today I'm in the same space I was in yesterday, I was in yesterday, so I didn't grow, so I didn't advance, so I'm sort of in a state of stagnation, spiritually speaking, then from the perspective of the Torah, I'm in an Egypt, I'm in a straits, I'm in limitation. Now, it may be a very comfortable limitation, right? I may have a very comfortable prison cell, right? But the point here is, if I am not fulfilling my potential, and my potential is in some sense infinite, it's beyond what I am today, then in some sense I'm in Egypt, right? If somebody tells you, I think you're very good at what you did, but I think that you reached the capacity of what you could reach. I think you can't get any smarter, you can't get any kinder, you can't get, you plateaued. Right? That's very offensive, because innately we feel that no matter how much we accomplish, we're ambitious, spiritually speaking, and we know we can accomplish more. We sense it. So the Egypt is the notion that I am limited and comfortable with what I have achieved until now. And the Exodus from Egypt, and this is why it's so important in Judaism, and this is why we have to do it every day, and not only every day but every night, is because the Exodus from Egypt is going out of limitation. So one way to do this is every time you read the Haggadah, the Passover story, and you read Egypt, you think about Egypt, but you also think about, and you ask, what is my Egypt? What is the limitation right now that I am dealing with, that I have to break out of? So that is meditation number 1. We're going to talk a lot about Egypt on the night of Passover, redefining Egypt, not just as something of the past, but as something of the present that we deal with every day. And Egypt doesn't have to be, in the Kabbalah, you have terms, you have the Egypt of the unholy, but you also have a holy Egypt. Holy Egypt is holy limitation. I'm involved in good things. I'm in a good space, but it's limited. Okay, that's holy Egypt. So we have to escape not just the negative Egypt, but also the holy Egypt. That is the first step of our journey. We have to understand. You open up a map, right? What do they say? The most important thing of the map is you are here, right? So we want to hear about the story. So what is the story? Oh, we were in Egypt and we have to leave Egypt. Okay, so what is Egypt? You have to define what is Egypt, and we have just done so. Now, once we understand what Egypt is, now we're going to see how some of the ingredients of the night are designed to help us break out of the Egypt and propel us toward Exodus from that Egypt. Okay, at any point, if anyone has any comments or questions, you should please ask. When I was a kid, every time you asked the question and the teacher didn't know the answer, he would say, save your question for the Passover night. So here we're preparing for the Passover night, so there's no time to save your questions. If you have any comments or questions, please don't hesitate to jump in. Okay, fine. So that is Egypt. Now we want to think about what is the antidote to Egypt? How do we get out of Egypt? So obviously, one of the most important ingredients of the night, mitzvot of the night, is matzah. So just to give a little bit of a background for a moment of what we do on the night of Passover and what's sort of biblical and what's rabbinic. We discussed this yesterday and last week, that in the times of the temple, you had matzah. There was a biblical commandment to eat matzah, to eat bitter herbs, together with the Pesach offering, the meat of the Paschal lamb. Today we don't have the temple, so we don't have the Paschal lamb. We also, therefore, do not have the bitter herbs, because the bitter herbs were just the bitter herbs was an ingredient for the Paschal lamb. So we are in a sense not obligated to have bitter herbs from the Torah's perspective. However, rabbinically, there is a mitzvah to eat bitter herbs to commemorate the bitter herbs that we had in the temple times. So to summarize, the matzah is biblical, the bitter herbs are rabbinic, the 4 cups of wine are rabbinic. What else is biblical that day, that night of Passover? I guess the other biblical commandment is to tell the story. So we're going to talk about that. And these are the big themes we want to talk about. Hopefully we'll have a meditation for each of those. Matzah, which is biblical, bitter herbs, which is rabbinic. Today it's rabbinic, I should say. 4 cups of wine, rabbinic. Telling the story, biblical. Once we cover all those themes, then we can start thinking about specific meditations. Okay, so far, what do we have? So far, we have Egypt is limitation, and that's why there's a commandment to commemorate the Exodus every single day, because every day I have my personal limit. I have my own limitation. I have a new limitation. What yesterday was freedom, today becomes limitation because I already achieved that, and I have to break free. Okay, so what's Passover? Yeah, Passover is the energy of freedom that I can internalize within me, which will allow me to break free every day. But once a year, you have to sort of reconnect to the energy of freedom, which is available on the night of Passover. And once I internalize that, then I can have a miniature Exodus every day. Okay, fine. So we know what's Egypt. Now we know that Egypt is the problem. The antidote, the solution is matzah. How is matzah the solution to limitation? So there are multiple meditations within matzah. The question is where to start from. So we'll start from the simple one. Matzah, from the perspective of the Kabbalah, is referred to as the bread of faith. The Zohar refers to the matzah as mechat mehemnuta, which is Aramaic for the bread of faith. Why is matzah the bread of faith? Because simply, what does matzah represent? Matzah represents people who are leaving Egypt, which is the center of civilization at the time, and going into a desert which is inhospitable to human life. So rationally, you can't leave Egypt, right? The Medrash says no slave ever left Egypt. Why not? Because what are you going to do when you leave Egypt? You're going to end up in the desert. You can't survive in the desert, right? It's not like you can get on to catch a train to the suburbs. So the fact that the Jewish people follow Moses into the desert with a little bit of dough, but that's about it, And the fact that the dough wasn't even prepared shows that they did not have provisions, yet they just followed Moshe, I would say blindly, but they followed Moshe with blind faith. That is why matzah, the story of the matzah, symbolizes the faith. So we'll come full circle to a deeper dimension of faith, but on a very basic level. The first ingredient, or one on the first, a critical ingredient that a person needs to be able to break out in Egypt break out of their own Egypt, is to be able to believe in their ability to do so, or believe in Hashem granting them the ability to do so. So in other words, what holds me back is the ability, is the fear of failure. I say, I can't do it. Why don't I go beyond myself? Why don't I become more kind? Why don't I become more patient? Why don't I become more anything? Fill in the blank. The answer is I can't. I tell myself I can't. I don't believe I can do it. And that's why, so that keeps me in the Mitzrayim, that keeps me in the spiritual Egypt. So the antidote to the spiritual Egypt is the matzah, because matzah is, on the most basic level, before we get even more mystical, matzah is bread of faith. The people followed God into the desert, followed Moses into the desert, believed in God's capacity to help them. And that's the first, that's the most basic ingredient that you need to be able to break out belief that Hashem will give you the ability to do so. So that's one matzah meditation. Another interesting matzah meditation is the idea that with matzah, you think about what are the ingredients of matzah. So if you went to the matzah bakery, you know that matzah has nothing but flour and water. You can buy matzah that has eggs and has apple juice. No, I don't know if they have apple juice, but egg matzah. And you can buy flavored matzah. But that's okay for Passover, but it's not okay for the mitzvah of the night of Passover. So the mitzvah to eat matzah has to be just flour and water. The Talmud refers to it as lechem oni, bread of poverty. And if it's too much flavor, it's considered, it's not poverty, there's taste, and therefore that's not good for the mitzvah. But in any case, what we're getting at here is that the ingredients of matzah are going to be flour and water. But another important ingredient of matzah, if you ever went to the matzah bakery, is the speed, right? The matzah cannot, the dough cannot rise. So there has to be the element of speed. In fact, the Talmud says, it says, "Ushmartem et hamatzot," guard the matzot. Now there is an interesting play, because in the play on the words, because in the Torah, as we know, the letters do not have vowels. So matzot could also be read mitzvot. Guard the matzah, meaning guard it that it should not become leavened, that enough time shouldn't pass so it shouldn't rise and become chametz, become leavened bread. But the sages read it and they say what it means is, it can be read it, ushmartem et ha-mitzvot, guard the mitzvot, guard the commandments. And the way the Talmud explains it, the Talmud says, mitzvah haba liyadcha, if you have a mitzvah that comes to your hand, in other words, if you have the opportunity to do a mitzvah, so they say al tachmitzena. Literally, al tachmitzena means don't make it chametz, don't make it leaven. But in Hebrew, lehachmitz could mean become leavened. Lehachmitz could also mean to miss the opportunity. I missed the opportunity is it became chametz, it became delayed, right? So it's interesting that the bread rising and delaying something and missing something because of delay comes from the same word, because it's the same idea. The bread rises when time passes. Okay, so let's go back for a second, because we want to think about our second meditation of matzah. Matzah would be the antidote to the being in spiritual Egypt, which is limitation, because matzah represents the speed. And in simple English, what that means is that the most important step to be able to grow is not to postpone, not to delay. Much easier to say, I want to become a better person, I want to grow, I'm going to start next week, right? The idea here is that matzah would mean immediate, take immediate action, take the first step right now, do not delay. And that's what the matzah represents, the speed of action. You have the opportunity to grow, grab that opportunity, don't delay, because by the time it delays, it becomes chametz. You lose the enthusiasm, miss the opportunity, and you're still in a state of stagnation. So that's the second meditation for matzah. Number one, matzah would be the bread of faith, belief that I can grow, belief that I can succeed, belief that I can push further. And number two, matzah, the second meditation of matzah would be the speed. Don't delay. It has to be done as soon as you have the opportunity. And that's the step out. Often we miss the opportunity to grow because we delay. And by the time we delay, other things get in the way. Okay, so that's the second meditation. And now we get to the third one, but I'm going to take a break for a second to close the door. If anybody has any comments or questions, please share. Just give me 1 second. I apologize. Okay, beautiful. Okay, so we move on to one more matzah meditation, and then we'll move to the other themes. This is sort of, in some sense, the one that gets the most attention in Hasidic literature. And that is the concept of matzah as the antidote to the slavery, because we have to really re-examine what is chametz, what is the leavened bread, and essentially figure out what's keeping us in the prison in the first place. So if Mitzrayim is Egypt is the limitation, then what keeps us in Egypt is the Pharaoh. And in some sense, what is the Pharaoh? What does Pharaoh represent? So the Kabbalists explain, but other people say this, the Kabbalists elaborated, but it's written in earlier sources, that chametz is the ego. Inflated bread represents the inflated ego. And matzah, ego, in some sense, inflated ego would be what keeps us in the limitation. And the matzah, which is bread of humility, it's humble, it's flat, it doesn't have any taste, it's not arrogance. The matzah would be the antidote to the inflated ego, which therefore allows us to break free of Egypt. So we have to just elaborate a little bit, but this is going to be the kernel of the idea. And the idea goes something like this, that often what does not allow us to grow and change and become better would be the fear that it's going to bruise our ego. So just a simple example, let's say I get into a dispute with somebody, and I know I want to continue the relationship with the person. I know that I should apologize, but I'm like, I don't know, maybe let the other guy apologize first. And sometimes I'm not going to do the right thing. I'm not going to do what I know is right because I'm afraid that it's going to take a hit. My ego will take a hit and I'm not going to survive it. Right? So I'm afraid to take responsibility. I'm afraid to apologize. And in many cases, I'm afraid to try new things. I'm afraid of rejection, afraid of failure. If you think about a lot of what keeps us in one place, in stagnation, is the fear of, ultimately would be boiled down the fear of the bruise to our ego. And in that sense, the matzah would be the antidote, because matzah tells you, don't focus on the self, focus on what has to be done. And ironically, the less you focus on the self, the more you'll be able to actually expand the self. That's the irony here. If I'm worried about the self, then ultimately that traps me in self. If I'm able to let go of the focus on self, that actually liberates the self. And this is something we say every year. I say it every year, but it's probably a cute thing to know anyway. And that is as follows. So if you look at the letters, the words for chametz and matzah. So chametz and matzah, maybe we'll show it on the screen. Maybe we'll show it on the screen here in just a second. Okay, so I'm just looking at the letters chametz chametz and matzah. So this is chametz. Yeah, you write it with a final tzaddik, but it's the same idea. It's a tzaddik. Now, if you look at chametz and matzah, you'll see that it's actually the same letters. It's the same letters. You have mem and mem. Mem equals mem. Mem is the same as the mem, but tzaddik is like the tzaddik. So chametz and matzah, which are supposed to be two extremes, and Passover we have to eliminate all chametz, all leavened bread from the home. And matzah is sort of considered the bread of faith and the bread that's we're supposed to internalize. So this is sort of two extremes. And yet the letters are very, very similar. And we know that according to the Kabbalah, the Hebrew language, the letters of something, the letters of a word, the letters of a concept actually express its inner meaning. So it's interesting that things that are so seem to be polar opposites, yet when you look at the letters, it's the same exact thing. So you have almost the same. Mem and mem is the same. Tzaddik and tzaddik is the same. Okay, finally, we find a difference between the chametz and the matzah. The chametz is a chet, matzah is a hey. Okay, but if you think about it, chet and hey also, they're two different letters. They make a different sound, but in the way they look, they're very, very similar. The only difference in a chet and a hey is the hey on the left-hand side on the top, on the left-hand side, there's a little bit of a break between the bottom leg and the roof, as opposed to the chet, which is closed off on three sides. Hey is also closed off on three sides, but there's a little bit of a space on top. And this has a very cute meditation. I say cute because it's cute, not because it's not correct. This is written in the Kabbalah. It's very interesting. So the chet represents chametz. I'm trapped in my space in my own ego. So if I'm in the box, I have nowhere to get out. I can only go down. That's the chet. The matzah represents, again, I'm also in prison. I'm at the same starting point. I'm at the same situation as the chametz. I'm still trapped. I have that negativity that surrounds me from all directions. I can only go down, but there is an opening. There's an opening in the prison cell. Now, the problem with this opening is it's very small. And therefore, even visually, to get out, I can't get out with my inflated ego. I have to flatten the ego to be able to get out. And this is just a visual metaphor in the letters of chametz and matzah, chet and hey. The question is that if I don't have the humility, I'm going to be trapped in the current situation. And if I could create that humility, take the focus of self, think about what has to be done, ultimately that frees me from my inhibitions and that allows me to break free. So that's a little bit about the matzah. We spent 30 minutes on the matzah, summarize very quickly. We'll do the 3 meditations of the matzah, and then we'll continue. Hopefully before Pesach, send you an email with a summary of everything we're saying, so you'll have it in 1 or 2 paragraphs every meditation. And you can print it out before the holiday and use it for your Passover Seder, and hopefully that would be meaningful. But in any case, so where are we up to right now? Egypt is limitation. Exodus from Egypt is expanding our limitation, going beyond the limitation that we had yesterday, and broadening our capacity for growth. So that's Egypt. And then we get to matzah. So we say matzah, we have a few meditations. Number 1, we said matzah is the bread of faith. You follow God into the desert with no food. That's what the matzah represents. That means the number 1 ingredient to growth is you have to believe in it. Number 2, we say matzah is the concept of speed. Don't delay. If you know there's a problem, tackle it immediately. That's really what matzah represents. You have an opportunity to grow, do it, grab it, engage in it immediately. And number 3, we say matzah is going to be the concept of humility. And often, as we mentioned, what keeps us trapped is the protection. We want to protect our own ego, inflated ego. And matzah is the ability to take the focus off self, put the focus on what has to be done. And ultimately, that is what creates the opportunity, allows us for the growth. It allows us to break free from the things that we're afraid of, and of even something as basic as afraid for myself. I'm afraid of disappointment. I'm afraid of internal disappointment. These are all things that ultimately could be drawn back to the concept of inflated ego, and the humility is what allows us to break out of that little space on the top of the hay that will allow us to get out of the Egypt. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is a little bit about Egypt and a little bit about the matzah. Now we still have other themes that we want to talk about. We want to talk about the bitter herbs. We want to talk about the 4 cups of wine. We want to talk about the story. A lot to mention. Okay, so let's talk about the bitter herbs for a moment. Maror bitter herbs. Part of remembering the story is thinking about the pain. If you look at the Haggadah, maybe there's some mention about the miracles and the 10 plagues and God taking us out of Egypt. That certainly has some real estate in the pages of the Haggadah, but you also have a lot of description about the pain. And that's part of the idea. You have to remember the pain, and that will, and then think about the contrasts and celebrate the exodus from that painful situation. But in some sense, it's actually a little bit psychologically difficult. It's not such an easy transition to think about the freedom and the slavery together. In fact, the Torah says that everything we do on that night, we have to see ourselves as free people, see ourselves as liberated. And that's why there were Jewish customs that you're supposed to put out your fancy silverware on the Passover table. And you're supposed to recline like free people. In other words, even if you are living in a difficult situation in exile, in the diaspora, under persecution, but the night of Passover, we're supposed to do everything we can to feel ourselves as free people. So we're working very hard to put us in the state of free people. We're drinking wine, we're reclining, etc. Now the problem is that seemingly when you think about the pain, you think about the slavery, and you think about the bitter herbs in some sense, somehow or another that makes it more difficult to celebrate if you're thinking about the pain, if you're commemorating the pain and then commemorating the trauma. So it seems like it's 2 completely different themes. But Judaism is essentially telling us that part of what you need to grow further, in many cases, what you need also is you have to embrace the bitterness. In other words, what we're saying here is that person has to see and sense the pain of the limitation, whatever that limitation is. The pain could be the fuel for growth. And here, as we study the Tanya this past year, and the Tanya talks about this 10 chapters, talk about the critical importance of joy. And a person must be joyous and enthusiastic, otherwise you're not going to be able to fulfill your purpose of creation. And there in the Tanya, he distinguishes between what he calls sadness and bitterness. Now, again, I don't know if this translates in Hebrew perfectly, in English perfectly, but in the Hebrew, the notion of sadness is, at least as defined here, is when a person is saddened and therefore the sadness drains one of energy. I'm sad, so I just lie in bed. I can't accomplish anything. I can't do anything. That sadness is never anything good. We have to deal with that sadness head on when it presents itself because it's spiritually dangerous. Bitterness, the Tanya explains, is actually something that is far more beneficial in certain cases, because bitterness does have a lot of fuel, does have a lot of energy. I'm upset at something, I'm saddened by something, but that is actually motivates me to change, motivates me to fight, motivates me to improve. And in that sense, what we're saying is an ingredient of the joy is to be, an ingredient of the Exodus is, an ingredient for freedom is the ability to sense the bitterness, to embrace the bitterness, to realize that the situation I'm in right now is painful to me, painful to the people around me, and allow that bitterness to be the motivation for the growth. So the bitterness is not something we're escaping when we want to go out of Egypt. It's something we have to embrace and feel so that we should be able to continue. And that should be the fuel for the growth. The next thing we want to talk about is a biblical commandment, and the biblical commandment is to speak the words of the story, to verbalize the story. And here we have in the Haggadah says that even if people are, okay, maybe we'll share it. So I'm looking at the Haggadah. So this is right after the 4 questions. We say as follows: we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Lord our God took us out from there with a strong hand and with an outstretched arm. If the Holy One, blessed be He, had not taken our fathers out of Egypt, then we, our children, and our children's children would have remained enslaved to Pharaoh in Egypt. Even if all of us were wise, all of us understanding, all of us knowing the Torah, we would still be obligated to discuss the Exodus from Egypt. And everyone who discusses the Exodus of Egypt at length is praiseworthy. In other words, when we sit on the night of Passover and we tell the story, it's not because we don't know the story. We know the story. Yet there's a mitzvah to saper, speak, to verbalize the story of the Exodus. And the next passage tells it to you with the story, because the night of Passover, so we tell stories. And we have the story. It happened that Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Tarfon were reclining at a Seder in Bnei Brak. They were discussing the Exodus from Egypt all that night until their students came and told them, our masters, the time has come to reciting the morning Shema. In other words, if you thought you had a long Seder, they had the Seder the entire night, and they literally told the story until the morning. So what do we say? They're fulfilling, and we have a beautiful picture here on the side of the rabbis reclining and reciting the story. So even if you know the story, even if you understand the meaning of the story, you still have to verbalize it. So let's think about this concept of what does it mean to talk? What does it mean to speak? What does it mean to say? So there's a beautiful Kabbalistic interpretation that says as follows, that Pesach, the word Pesach, Passover, we know the etymology of the word Pesach is leaping over, because God leaped over the homes of the Jewish people when the night of the Exodus, when He struck the firstborn Egyptians. But the Kabbalists say there are other meanings of that word. And one of the beautiful interpretations is that the word Pesach is actually a combination of 2 words. It's Pesach, mouth speaking. And what the Kabbalists say is essentially the ability to be free is the ability to speak. And if you look at the story of the Exodus, with even the slavery, in the book of Exodus, you look at the story of the slavery, you see that when the Jewish people are slaves, they cannot talk. Even when they cry to God, it says that when the slavery became harsh, when the work became harsh, the Jewish people sighed from the work, Vayitzaku, and they shouted. So they shout to God, but they can't speak. Then, once you have the 10 commandments, with the 10 plagues that arrive, and it comes to the last 3 plagues, God tells Moses, you know why? I'm going to take you out of Egypt. You know what's going to happen? Leman tisaper, so you'll be able to tell the story to your children. So you see here that the inability to speak is a property of slavery, and freedom is synonymous with the ability to speak, the ability to tell. And there are different ways to think about this, but one way to think about it is that when a person is in any situation, a difficult situation, whatever it may be, any situation, but a difficult situation in particular, I'm a victim of my circumstances unless I could tell myself a story, unless I could tell myself and understand a context of why this is happening and what I'm supposed to do and how this event could be a step to growth. So in other words, before I tell my story, before I say a story, before I tell myself a story, I'm the victim of the circumstance. Whatever circumstances throw at me, I respond to them, but I'm just passive. The ability to tell a story is the ability to see and realize that there's a plot, that there's a reason. Something is happening for me, something is happening, but that requires me to respond in a certain way. So the story represents finding context and finding meaning in my life. And the ability to see that is the ability to be free, because freedom in this context means that I'm not reacting to the situation. I'm not trapped by the situation, but I can reinterpret it and use it and understand what the situation calls out from within myself. So in that sense, speaking and telling the story, yes, we tell the story of the Exodus, but we're also telling the story of the Exodus of our own life. And so what are my challenges? What is my Egypt? How do I respond to that Egypt? Why does God send me those challenges? What can I do to use those challenges as catalyst to growth? That, ladies and gentlemen, is the idea of telling of the story, which creates the freedom. And that's why I think it's so important, because it's actually one of the biblical commandments, because the speaking is the ability to break free. We have one more general theme that we have to talk about, which is the 4 cups. Afterwards, we'll summarize everything we said, and we'll have a few minutes left to get to specific meditations about the specific things we say in the Haggadah. Okay, so what do we know about the 4 cups of wine? So the 4 cups of wine, we understand, first of all, that it is not biblical. The Torah doesn't tell us to drink 4 cups of wine or any cups of wine. The rabbis institute that we should drink 4 cups of wine, and they spread it out throughout the Seder, and every part of the Seder, every cup of wine is associated with one mitzvah. First cup of wine is associated with the Kiddush, the sanctification of a day. Second cup is associated with this telling, the mitzvah of telling the story. The third one is the grace after meals, and the fourth one is for the songs of praise that we say at the end of the Seder. So we have 4 cups of wine scattered throughout the Seder. What's interesting about the cups of wine is that in some sense, the cups of wine are the exact opposite of the matzah, which is the most important ingredient of the night. But in some sense, the 4 cups of wine are not just addition, but they're opposite. How so? Matzah, we said, is the bread of lechem oni, bread of poverty. And it has no taste, no wealth, no taste. Wine is the exact opposite, is the polar opposite. Wine was a luxury, and wine represents taste. So what is happening here? So the Hasidic interpretation is as follows. So let's just give one more introduction. Why do we drink 4 cups of wine? So the rabbis say, well, we drink 4 cups of wine as follows, because when God sends Moshe to tell the people about the Exodus, he tells Moshe to tell the Jewish people the news of the Exodus, but God employs 4 expressions of redemption. It says, "V'hitzesi, I'll take you out. V'hitzalti, I will redeem you. I'll take you out. I will save you, redeem you, and take you from me as a people." So we have 4 expressions of redemption, and because we have 4 expressions of redemption, we're going to have 4 cups of wine. Okay. So what do the commentaries do? They ask, 1 second, if 4 is such a great number, then why 4 cups of wine? Why not 4 matzahs? Should have 4 matzahs. So the answer has to be that matzah is associated with number 3, and 4 cups of wine is associated with number 4. So what's really happening here? What's really happening here is as follows. Matzah represents the freedom that God gives us. In other words, we have not yet internalized the freedom. It's been gifted to us. Matzah has no taste, right? In the beginning of the process, freedom doesn't have a taste. It's not enjoyable, right? If I have a negative habit and I break out of that habit and I try to improve my behavior in any area, and I want to lead a healthier lifestyle, for example, in the beginning, it's not enjoyable. It doesn't have any taste of freedom. It's actually very difficult. It's actually very painful. It could be very painful to break free. So in that sense, the Exodus doesn't have a taste. The people don't appreciate the taste of freedom, because in the beginning, the taste of freedom is not freedom is not tasty. Freedom in some sense is difficult. You do it because you know it's the right thing to do. You're breaking your negative habits. It's not something that's enjoyable. And for the Jewish people to escape into the unknown wasn't either enjoyable. That represents the first three expressions of redemption. God will take us out. God will redeem us. God will save us. These are things that God says, time to go, we're out of here. You don't necessarily appreciate how this is going to help you, how this is going to be enjoyable for you. But God tells you that it is, and that's what you do, and that's what you follow. You take the right steps. It's like your doctor tells you to do something, so you do it. I don't enjoy it. It doesn't taste good for me. My doctor says no more salt. Okay, I don't like it. It's difficult for me, but I'll do it. So that's the matzah. The wine represents that over time, the fourth expression of redemption is God will take us to him as a people. That occurs at Sinai. At Sinai, 7 weeks after the redemption, okay, at Sinai, what happens? We start appreciating the freedom. Now we see, we broke out of Egypt. We have a spiritual life. We're developing spiritually. We get the pleasure of what we're doing. Okay, so that's something when we internalize the message of the freedom, the message of the freedom, then it becomes enjoyable to us, and that's what wine represents. So in some sense, the matzah is the beginning of the journey, and the wine represents the internalization of the freedom, and that's enjoyable. So even in the beginning of the process, we drink the wine to commemorate, to remind us and say, yes, now the journey may be painful, but don't worry, because over time, it's going to be as enjoyable as wine. So that's why both of those are important. We start with the matzah, which has no taste, because the beginning is difficult. The beginning of freedom is difficult. We don't appreciate it. It's not internalized, but we get to the point where it can be internalized. So that is the main ideas of the Passover Seder, main meditations. So I'm going to summarize very quickly in the next 2-3 minutes, and then we'll see if we have a few minutes to go specific concepts. But if anybody wants to make a comment or ask a question, please do. Otherwise, we'll do the summary. Okay, very quickly, in 120 seconds or less. Egypt is limitation. Pharaoh is the ego that keeps us trapped in our limitation. The antidote to limitation is the matzah, because matzah represents humility. So that's one meditation of matzah. Matzah also represents faith. They follow God into the desert without provisions. That represents the belief that God will help me break free. Without belief, there is no freedom. And matzah is also speed. Matzah can rise, speed. If you want to break out of the limitation, if you want to improve your circumstance, don't wait for tomorrow. Tomorrow it's going to be more difficult. Grab the opportunity today. So those are the 3 matzah meditations: humility, faith, and speed. Okay, then we go to bitter herbs. The bitter herbs represent the idea that sensing the bitterness of my current situation can actually become the fuel to redemption. Sometimes what motivates me to change is the pain that I currently experience. So don't ignore that pain, embrace it, internalize it, as long as it's bitter. Bitter, again, is not sadness. Sadness means when the pain drains me of energy. Bitterness is when the pain infuses me with energy. So that's the maror, that's the bitter herbs. Then we get to the story, tell the story. Tell the story means understand that what's happening to me is not just random. There is meaning, there's purpose, there's plot. In the story, there's plot, there's elements, but there's also the character development. I have an important part of the story. I have to step up to the story. So the story is actually liberating, because it helps me understand that I'm not a victim of what's happening to me. I'm an active player in the story. I have to understand the plot, and I have to see myself and see this as part of the plot that's going to lead and unfold to the future freedom. And finally, the final thing we spoke about was the 4 cups of wine. 4 cups of wine is, yes, in the beginning, breaking free is difficult. Over time, it may take 7 weeks, the way it took in the first iteration, when the Jewish people left Egypt and came to Sinai and became God's people and received the 4th expression of redemption. But over time, what is very difficult and tasteless in the beginning of the process later becomes enjoyable and internalized and enjoyable like wine. So these are the major themes. And thank you for joining. And I hope this was somewhat meaningful. Okay, we still have 4 or 5 minutes left. So I want to talk about another concept or two, some beautiful concepts that we think about when we do the Seder. And this is something, the first thing I'm going to say is something that the Rebbe spoke about a few times. It's a very interesting question. That can be raised when we start the Passover Haggadah. Okay, so what happens? So we do a few things. When we start the Passover Seder, we do go through a few steps. We sanctify the day, we wash our hands, we dip a vegetable in salt water. We break the middle matzah. So essentially, this is the beginning. What happens in the beginning? So we introduce what's happening here. We introduce, this is the bread of affliction that our fathers ate in the land of Egypt. Whoever is hungry, let him come and eat. Whoever is in need, let him come in and conduct the Seder of Passover. This year we are here, next year in the land of Israel. This year we are slaves, next year we will be free people. So this is a very short passage that has at least 3 clauses, and each of them requires analysis and trying to figure out what's the connection to this part of the Seder and what's the connection to the other clauses. So there's a lot to talk about. I'm going to talk about the middle clause. We say, whoever is in need, whoever is hungry, let him come and eat. Whoever is in need, let him come and conduct the Seder of Passover. The problem with this passage is the placement. Why are you inviting people to the Passover Seder once the Passover Seder already started? If you want to invite people, say this a week before, say this a day before, say this in synagogue at the night of Passover when people may still be there that don't have a place to go. You come home, you start the Passover Seder, you gave everybody the first cup of wine, you already started the process of the Passover Seder, and then you remember to say, oh, by the way, if anyone is hungry, come visit us. Yeah, of course, nobody's home. Nobody's here to hear the proclamation. So why are we doing this? So there is all kinds of interpretations, but I'm going to tell you one meditation that the Rebbe spoke, and I think is very beautiful. And the idea is like this. We're talking about freedom, and freedom represents ultimately freedom. We said what keeps us in the prison often is the inflated ego. The inflated ego, when a person is in a state of spiritual slavery, inflated ego, it's very hard for the person to sense the need of somebody else. So yes, I may invite you to my house, but not because necessarily you need it, because I like when I have guests. To really empathize with somebody else is something that you have to do that. You have to be able to become spiritually free, in a sense, free of the focus on self. Be able to transcend self and connect to somebody else. That's the ultimate sign of freedom. And what we're saying here is, yes, of course, I invited you to my Seder a week ago, or you invited somebody either literally or figuratively. Yes, you can interact with other people. But here, you break the matzah, right? We break the matzah, we get the middle matzah, we break the matzah. Again, an act of humility. What's the first thing that's going to happen when we interact with the matzah, with the bread of humility, even before we eat it? What's the first thing that's going to happen? The first thing that's going to happen, and that's also the result of the freedom, but it's also the test of the freedom. In other words, the sign of the freedom. And that is, if I can be free, then I could see somebody else's need. So I take the matzah, I break it in half. What's the next thing I say? I say, whoever is hungry. I discover, oh, wow, interesting. There are people that are hungry. I discover there are people that are in need. So now I want to bring them in. So that is a result of the spiritual freedom that happens when I eat the matzah. When I didn't eat it yet, but when I touch the matzah, I start engaging with the matzah. So in some sense, what we're saying here is that the test of freedom is the ability to go beyond oneself and see what the other person and see the other person's needs and the other person's pain. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story in short. Thank you for joining. I hope this was meaningful. Again, I'm going to, God, bli neder, without a vow, hopefully next week before the Passover, we'll send out an email with some of these meditations so you can print them out and enjoy them. But in the meantime, Passover is a night of questions. So questions, comments, you agree, disagree, whatever you like, please share. Otherwise, have a wonderful day. And we should see each other in good health on happy occasions. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Zina. Thank you.
Thank you.